The dim light of the Liverpool afternoon filtered through the half-drawn curtains as Paul McCartney stood in the hallway of Duff Lowe's modest house, heart hammering like it hadn't since the early cavern days. 23 years, almost a quarter of a century, had slipped by since that scratchy acetate had left his hands. The single disc, 10 inches of aluminium coated in acetate, cut at 78 revolutions per minute in Percy Phillips' tiny front-room studio on Kensington, held 2 fragile tracks. Buddy Holly's "That'll Be the Day," on one side, John's voice raw and eager, and on the other, in spite of all the danger, their first original, credited to McCartney-Harrison but really Paul's melody with a bit of George's help, John's lead vocal carrying the weight of teenage longing. It had cost them 17 shillings and sixpence, pooled from whatever pocket money they could scrape together, and they'd taken turns with it, 1 week each, like passing around a secret talisman. John first, then Paul, George, Colin Hanton the drummer, and finally Duff Lowe on piano. The quiet school friend Paul had roped in because he could nail that Jerry Lee Lewis arpeggio on "Mean Woman Blues." Duff had kept it far beyond his week. Life had rushed in after that, Hamburg's red light grind, the leather jackets and the endless sets, Epstein's suit anti-polish, the screaming, the records, the films, the drugs, the breakup, the lawsuits, the silence that followed. The disc had simply vanished into the haze of those early days. Now, in the spring of 1981, it had resurfaced in a Sotheby's catalogue. Historic. Valuable. Someone else's auction lot. Paul had seen the listing almost by accident, flipping through a newspaper at breakfast in London, the small item jumping out like a slap. His first instinct had been disbelief, then a sharp, unexpected ache. That was them. Before everything. Before fame had turned them into icons and then torn them apart. Before John's murder had left a hole nothing could fill. The disc wasn't just memorabilia, it was proof they'd existed as boys with dreams bigger than Liverpool. He hadn't told Linda, hadn't called his office. He'd picked up the phone himself, dialed the number listed in the article, asked for John Lowe, Duff, and waited while the line crackled across the miles. Duff had sounded startled, then guarded. "Paul McCartney?" A pause. "I didn't expect you'd ring." They'd talked for nearly an hour that first call. Awkward at first, small talk about kids, weather, old mutual friends, then Duff admitted he'd had the disc valued. Sotheby's thought it might fetch a decent sum. Paul had felt his stomach twist. "It's not about money, Duff. Not for me." Another long silence. "I kept it in a sock drawer for years," Duff finally said. "Forgot about it mostly. Then someone said it might be worth something. I thought, why not?" Paul had driven up the next day. No entourage, no security, just him in a plain coat and dark glasses, parking a rented car 2 streets over to avoid attention. The house was quiet, terraced, unremarkable, much like the one Paul had grown up in on 4th Lynn Road. Duff opened the door wearing a cardigan and slippers, hair thinner now, face lined but still carrying that same gentle, slightly hesitant expression Paul remembered from school dances and quarryman rehearsals. "Come in," Duff said, stepping aside. The living room smelled of old books, faint tea, and something like dust that had settled too long. On a small wooden table near the window sat the disc, unprotected, no sleeve, just lying there like any old record. The label was handwritten in faded black ink, "That'll Be the Day, / in spite of all the danger, the Quarrymen." Paul's handwriting from 1958, slightly shaky with excitement. He stared at it, unable to move. "You kept it," he said again, voice barely above a whisper. Not anger. Something deeper, closer to grief. Duff shifted his weight. "I meant to pass it on. After my week. But, things happened. Mum got ill, then I moved, got married, kids. It just stayed. I never played it much, didn't want to wear it out. Then last year I showed it to a mate who knows about records. He said Sotheby's might be interested. I thought it was time to let it go. Paul stepped closer. His fingers hovered over the disc but didn't touch it yet. You know what this is, don't you? Not just a record. It's the start. The very first thing we ever put down. John singing lead on my tune. George doing that little solo. You on piano. Me thumping away on bass like I knew what I was doing. He gave a small, broken laugh. We were terrified that day. Percy Phillips barely looked at us, just set up the mic, told us to get on with it. 15 minutes, one take each side, tape wiped clean after. This is all that's left of that afternoon. Duff nodded slowly. I remember. You were all so alive. Like you already knew something big was coming. Paul finally picked it up. The shellac felt cool and impossibly light in his palm, edges slightly chipped from years of casual handling. He turned it over, studying the grooves as if they might speak. Memories flooded in unbidden, the smell of pipe tobacco in Philip's parlor, John's nervous energy, the way George's fingers had trembled on the strings at first, then steadied. And after Julia's death just days later, the grief that had settled over John like fog, the slow shift from Quarrymen to Beatles, the hunger that had driven them forward until it consumed them. I need it back, Paul said, eyes still on the disc. Not for museums. Not for auction. It's ours. Mine. The start of everything that came after. And everything that didn't. Duff watched him for a long moment. I was going to let them have it. Big money, maybe 10,000-12,000 quid. Enough to help with the kids' school fees, fix the roof. But then you rang. Same day the paper ran the story. Like. I don't know. Fate. Paul looked up. How much? Duff named a figure. Higher than the estimate, £12,000, perhaps a touch more. Not extortionate by Paul's standards, but inflated enough to sting. The boy who'd once counted every shilling for bus fares and guitar strings could now write a check that would have bought a house back then. That was the shocking part. Time had turned their poverty into his wealth, and now he was buying back his own youth at a premium. Paul didn't haggle. He pulled out his checkbook, plain, no fanfare, and wrote the amount steadily, though his hand shook just once. He tore it off and held it out. Duff took it without looking at the numbers. Instead, he met Paul's eyes. You didn't have to come yourself. Could have sent someone. I had to, Paul replied. This isn't business. It's personal. Their fingers brushed as Duff handed over the disc. A brief, electric contact, two men who had once shared stages, cigarettes, and impossible dreams, now separated by fame, fortune, loss. Duff's eyes glistened. I never meant to keep it forever. I just didn't know how to let it go. Paul clutched the record to his chest, feeling its faint warmth through his shirt. Play it loud for me sometime, yeah. Duff said, voice cracking. Paul managed a nod. I will. When it's safe. I'll get it cleaned up proper. Make copies for the lads, George, Ringo. Linda. The kids. But the original, it'll stay with me. He turned toward the door. Outside, the street was quiet, ordinary Liverpool life going on, kids kicking a ball, a woman hanging washing. Paul paused on the threshold. Thank you, Duff. Really? Duff shrugged, almost shy. Tell John the First said hello, if you ever, you know. Paul's throat closed. I will. He walked to the car, acetate pressed against his heart like something alive and fragile. The weight of those early days, of John, of the cavern sweat, of the hope that had burned so bright before it flickered, lifted just enough to let him breathe. The danger had always been there, in the lyrics he'd written half in fear, in the losses that followed, in the silence after the split. But now he held proof they'd survived the start of it. Together. In the car, he didn't start the engine right away. He sat with the disc on his lap, staring at the handwriting that had once been so full of promise. Tears came then, quiet and unhurried. Not just for the record, but for the boys they'd been, the man John had become and lost, the music that had saved them and broken them in turn. Eventually he drove away, the acetate safe beside him on the passenger seat. Back in London that night, he would place it carefully in his vault, away from light and dust. Engineers would restore it later. Clean the surface noise, balance the levels, bring those young voices back as clearly as possible. He'd press a limited run of copies, 50 or so, for family, for friends, for the ones who'd been there from the beginning. Christmas gifts wrapped in plain paper, no fanfare. But the original would never leave his keeping again. As the miles rolled by, Paul allowed himself a small, private smile. The title track played in his head, unbidden, in spite of all the danger, "We'll be lovers." The words felt different now, older, wiser, sadder. But true. He had it back. And with it, a piece of the beginning that no amount of time or fame could ever truly erase.